Hello, everybody. I'm Andromeda Yuyi, and this is part 2 of 30 Years in the Golden North. The section is called Across the Lena to the Kuzskaya Desert. I easily got across the vast river Angara on a raft. Then I rode through regions where various Mongolian tribes live, and finally, the natives, particularly the nomads, told me that I should soon reach the river Lena and would approach the Kuzskaya Desert. But before I got there, I came upon 2 small Mongolian villages. In one of them, the Buryats were living. They were people of tall stature and wore kaftans. I heard that they were dying out very rapidly. They were unpleasant people, and I could not get a morsel of food from them, even for money. The second village was populated by Tunguses, pleasant folk with similar manners to the nomads. In the evening they would sit together in front of their houses and play and dance to the sound of balalaikas. I obtained various edibles from them in the morning, and far better than the nomads gave me. They were much cleaner, and also they had beef, and accepted money for their supplies. From them I bought nearly a cartload of food for 3 tsarist rubles. The cheapness of it frankly took my breath away, and later on, particularly in Alaska, when things were shockingly dear, I often remembered that village in the plain. I blessed those good folk when I moved on from there and slowly drew near to the river Lena. I did not move forward at random across the plain. There was a road which led right to the spot where the river could be crossed. On the shore of this big river there lived an old ferryman who had a wooden scaffold from which an iron pipe passed to the opposite shore. There was room on the raft for as much as 2 pairs of horses, and he charged 10 kopecks for ferrying you across. I was so glad that at last I had got across the river, which was to take me northwards, that when I reached the other side, I gave the old man 10 rubles. He thereupon knelt down and kissed my feet. I was not sorry that I had paid the man so lavishly. He gave me exact information as to the way I should go to reach the Kuzskaya Desert. On the way to this desert, I passed through a 3rd Mongolian village situated alongside the river. It was inhabited by nomads, Tunguses, and Buryats. It contained also a tiny shop, in which I added to my store of provisions so as to get safely through the desert, which was only a few days' journey from that spot. I also laid in stock of fodder for the horse. I stayed there for half a day, and then I set out boldly. I knew that I was getting near a difficult stage of my long journey. For 4 more days, the road led across a fine plain on the right bank of the river Lena, beside which there were dense forests. But at last, on the 4th day, I stood on the edge of the Kuzskaya Desert. It is a dreary, forlorn place, bare sand, parched by the heat, dotted here and there with clumps or strips of grass, scorched by the sun. There was a road across the desert which had been roughly marked out by the Mongolian settlers, but in places the tracks were completely lost in the sand. I made only very slow progress in the sweltering heat. On the right hand there was an endless desert. On the left, a strip of the dense forest showed the direction from which the Lena was flowing. I could not keep alongside the river because this huge stream is bordered by an impenetrable strip of thickets, brush, and swamps. But the river showed me the direction, and I was now going due north, and had kept close to it. Sometimes I was only a few hundred yards from the water, so that now and then I could run down to the river and fetch a barrel of water. In places it was so hot that I ran down 10 to 15 times a day with the barrel to get water for the horse, who otherwise would have dropped with thirst and fatigue. I never met a living soul for 25 days at a time, for that was how long it took me before I could joyfully breathe a sigh of relief on the other side of this desert. When I had been quite a long time in the desert, I reached a place where I saw a pile of human bones, a mournful proof that some traveler, the victim of the desert, had sunk down here and never risen again. I did not feel altogether at ease when I saw these mournful relics. What caused me much greater terror than these bones were the places where, instead of sand, there was dried grass, a parched carpet of which extended in all directions as far as the eye could see. Here I was afraid to strike a match, because I might at once find myself in the midst of a sea of flames. So I couldn't do any cooking, and in fact, I did not even dare to light my pipe. I always kept on the move from break of day till twilight had well set in, as long as I could see the road, because I knew that my horse moved along very slowly, and that I had to take into account the loss of several hours daily for fetching water up. I wanted to get across these inhospitable regions as quickly as possible. On the 25th day, the desert suddenly ended in a rampart of dense forests. I breathed a deep sigh of relief. In the forest there was game, which I could shoot. There was plenty of shade, and with a small cart I could ride there comfortably, especially where there was a road, showing the direction toward Kirensk. For several days I moved on through the forest until I came to a town situated on the river Lena. I now had a tough stretch of journey behind me, a small measure of achievement in my struggle with the Siberian continent, but small though it was, it cheered me up. In Kirensk, the population consisted almost entirely of Mongolian tribes, although here and there I noticed a white face. Beside traders, there were also butchers who sold beef and reindeer meat at remarkably low prices. There was also a Russian government official, and even a magistrate's court. But I did not pay a visit either to the official or to the magistrate, because I had not enough supplies and needed nobody's help or support. So I moved along across Kirensk and observed the inhabitants and their customs. For the greater part, they were Tunguses. Here and there, I noticed also political prisoners who, although in chains, nevertheless, in some cases, were living on their own farms with their families. I saw that the country was a good one, with large flocks of cattle. I was especially pleased to see flocks of reindeer. I felt that I really was getting somewhere nearer to the north, which is the home of these animals. I did not stay long in Kirensk. I bought plenty of ammunition and set out in the direction toward Vitimsk, again close to the river Lena. Here my journey led me in places through dense forests. There were some paths there, but they were very much neglected, and in places disappeared altogether. Here and there I met with a peasant, and all I came across were good folk. If my appearance had been at all suspicious, perhaps they would have set on me and dragged me back to the authorities, but they always let the peaceful wanderer go his way, and in fact, I even received a trifle from them. My quiet journey suddenly ended in front of a huge watercourse. This was the river Vitim, about 150 yards wide. What was I to do now? For 2 days I wandered to and fro upon the shore, looking for tracks leading to the water. At last I discovered traces of peasants' carts in the direction of the water, and I at once stripped, and first of all, tried to get to the other shore by myself. How delighted I was when I discovered that at its deepest point, the water reached only as far as my chest. I at once went back for the horse, and together we dragged the cart through the waves along the uneven bottom. It was hard work. It took us 2 hours, but at last we managed to get to the other side, where a magnificent meadow greeted us. The grass there was taller than a man. I let my wet horse go and eat his fill. I myself ran to and fro along the shore for a while, and jumped about to warm myself after such a long bath. At last I dressed and cooked a meal, while the horse was grazing, and now forward along the river to Vitimsk. I soon reached there, and the road was an easy use. I stayed 2 days at Vitimsk. I had to have a bit of rest and buy some supplies. There I saw many more white men than at Kirensk, among them Mongols. The Yakuts now began to make their appearance. I made the acquaintance of a number of Russians there, and told them that I was on my way from Krasnoyarsk to the Arctic Ocean. They nearly split their sides with laughter and told me not to be a fool, and that it was impossible to make such a journey. But I paid no attention to what they said. My first confidence was not shaken. My resolve was firm, and I started off again, fully convinced that I should reach my goal. Immediately beyond Vitimsk, I came upon some huge forests. Here and there, the going was bad, because the roads disappeared, and I had to make my way among the trees. But they were not so close together as to stop me from driving my cart along. I came across some trees growing there that are called locust trees, and the branches were so overloaded with the long locust pods that they nearly touched the ground, so that I could pluck them to my heart's content. There were also birches, firs, and pines, the upper branches of which were entangled so as to form one dense green archway. Whenever I stopped and looked up at the treetops, I felt quite overawed at the hugeness of the trees. Later on, I went through nearly all the vast and terrific forests in northern Canada and Alaska. But nowhere have I been so disturbed and overwhelmed by such a feeling of my own insignificance in comparison with the vastness of the forest as here. In some places, the green roof of the ancient trees was so dense that even in the middle of the day I had to light a lamp and move slowly along past the tall rows of tree trunks. On the other hand, this deep twilight was pleasantly cool. The worst of it was that I had blundered into treacherous swamps. Here and there I again found a pathway and followed it, and in fact encountered 2 or 3 peasants' carts. The natives were on their way to the market at Vitimsk. The swamps consisted of rainwater. I hardly think they were caused by the river Lena overflowing its banks, because when I got beyond Vitimsk, I had moved a good distance away from it to the left. The soil in the forests is covered with moss. There are clumps of thickets here and there, and on all sides there are heaps of fallen branches, most of which I generally had to fling on one side before I could drive through. In places, the trees themselves lay higgledy-piggledy on top of each other, warped with age, and most of them already changed into masses of dry rot, swarming with insects. But they were never lying in the road. In a number of places I noticed that a tree had rolled onto the road, but it had been hacked away, so as not to be an obstacle to drivers. The journey through this dense forest did not last long, about 3 days of easy riding, and then the road turned aside from the forest into the swamps, where in some places I floundered into the marsh up to my knees. I had to drive through it. After the swamps there was a new set of deep forests. But as I went on my way, my experience, my courage, and my self-confidence increased. I encountered various things that made me come to a standstill for a time in bewilderment, not knowing what I was to do. But these predicaments grew less and less. I still continued, however, to have great difficulties when crossing these forests, on account of the thickets, which always formed a dense barrier, sometimes 50, sometimes 500 yards abroad, at the edge of the forest. In the depths there were none of these thickets. I sometimes had to cut my way through them if I wanted to get into the forest. There were days when I encountered 3 or 4 bears, and then I always at once seized my rifle and would have fired if the bear had attacked me or my horse. But this never happened. The animals left us in peace. I did not see any wolves in this region. It was summer, and at that season the wolves moved more to the north. The bears, too, kept more to the open spaces, to the broad meadow lands. Here the country was level. The forest extended across endless plains. Only in places I saw hills on either side, and I avoided them. I kept on always in the same direction, and so I went forward week after week, in places coming to the villages inhabited by Lamuts, Yakuts, and other tribes, which I could not even identify. But they all spoke nearly the same language, and at the same time I noticed that they looked rather different from the more southern tribes. The Yakuts, in particular, were always very well disposed towards me, and many of them spoke Russian very well. Those living in the regions surrounded by the forests in the distance lived mostly by cultivating flax. This work was performed for the greater part by the women, while the men would proceed in the summer to the river Lena, where they caught fish and game. The time I went that way, nearly the only people in the whole village were women, who invited me inside to entertain me. They also smiled meaningly. But what was the use? My thoughts were far from any love-making, for I was dead beat and worn out. And so I always stayed just long enough to eat a little of the fish which they offered me. They had bread too, but it tasted so unpleasant that I could not eat it. Altogether, I kept them at arm's length, for they were dreadfully dirty women, and they smelled badly. Particularly the Lamuts and the Tunguses, while the Yakut women were cleaner. On the whole, they were poverty-stricken people. I always asked how much farther it was to Olekminsk, through which I had to pass. They pointed to the north and made signs that it was a long way off.